I was going to start with acknowledgements anyway, but first a title slide. So hello everyone, and it's really great to be presenting our work here on how we can enable distancing behavior and what kinds of social dynamics there are around it. So this is work that I've been doing together with Ophelia Giroy, Guillaume Desakash, Marwa Alzine, Martha Newson, Justin Sulik, and Yi Zhao, alongside many other people who have crucially helped us collect the data, spread the word, and universities who helped with funding and promoting the work as well. So we are talking about herd security here, and this is obviously trying to make a distinction between the herd immunity talks going around and in contrast to them, how can we make sure that everybody is secure together as a community? And we first need to start by defining the problem. We know that social distancing or physical distancing, however you want to say it, is one of the most effective methods to prevent the spread of the disease. And everybody benefits from everybody else doing distancing. So great, why aren't we all just doing it? It's good for everybody. Well, the problem is that there's several problems with it. So firstly, our natural lives look a bit more like this beach scene. This is just one of the pictures that has been widely circulated when talking about how people are not obeying the distancing rules and blaming people for that and so on. And of course, there might be some individual responsibility, but we need to admit that practicing social distancing is a very unnatural way for many people because we are a very social species. We like to interact with each other, and importantly, we like to interact with each other in close proximity. We are physically close as well. And the graph on the right-hand side shows just a study that has looked at interaction quality and how much people feel bonded after interacting with each other through different mediums. So on the x-axis here, you see in person versus video chat versus audio chat versus instant messaging. And you can see that all sorts of social communication cues are conveyed best when you communicate with others in person as compared to video chat. And then, of course, come audio and instant messaging being much worse than any other form of communication that enables you to see the other person's face. But this gives us an idea about exactly why social distancing might be hard to attain. So this is the difficulty at the individual level, but there's also a difficulty at a larger level, at the more societal level, because distancing introduces a coordination cooperation problem in that if we want to attain herd security, then the herd needs to move in sync with each other. So the graph on the left here is, again, one of those widely circulated ones from a simulation study that looks at how different degrees of adherence to the pandemic containment measures is associated with infection rate. And you can see that if there is low adherence, the red spiky curve, there is a lot of infection. And then if there's medium adherence, it decreases considerably, but if there's high adherence, it almost disappears after about 50 days. So it is the case that no matter how much you adhere to the rules and distance yourself, you're not going to get to a much better state unless everyone else is doing it as well, unless there's high adherence at a community level and sustained as well, and at the same time as you. So it really looks like the fact that we are a very social species is the main problem why we can't do social distancing, because we want social closeness rather than distancing. But what I'll try to propose in this talk is that it's not the fact that we are social that causes the problem, but perhaps that might be the very solution to this problem as well. And I'm going to talk about 3 different levels of social scales. So on the innermost circle, the scale, there is a closed circle of friends and family. And then further up, there's the country, that's the national association you might be forming with others. And then there's world, because obviously social distancing and the COVID-19 pandemic, as the word implies, is a global problem at the same time. So there's a possibility that we might be aligning with the rest of the humankind for this particular problem. And I'll be talking about 3 factors that influence people's behavior, adherence behavior, their perceptions of vulnerability, other people's adherence, and other people's approval. So very quickly on the background a little bit. And if you have watched Ophelia DeRoy's talk yesterday, you might have seen the same figure, which is by Cristina Bicchieri, who tries to formulate different ways of enacting behavioral change in societies. And she says that there's 2 main drives. One of them is people following social norms, no matter what others do, because they are convinced that this change is needed, either because it's a custom or because it's morally the right thing to do. But another important way is of enacting behavioral changes if people prefer to follow it because they believe others are doing that as well. And that's what I'm going to focus on here. And she talks about 2 different, I was going to put a picture of a child imitating, because there's actually early roots of this kind of adherence behavior, how we learn it from others from very young ages onwards. But yeah, we can be influenced by what others are doing, and we can be influenced by what others are thinking. So how much do they approve of the norm? And Cialdini also talks about a similar distinction. He calls it descriptor injunctive, but no matter what you label it, how you label it, it is the case that there's this distinction between what other people do versus what other people think about the existing norms that influences your own behavior. So, like I said, I want to talk about these different social scales of bonding and how that influences individual behavior. So this is just one study among many of out of cross-cultural and large database analysis, which shows that on average, we humans tend to have around 5 other people in our small circle, close circle. These are the people whom we turn to for advice and comfort in times of need. These aren't people that we always interact with necessarily, but these are the core people in our lives. But this isn't all the social bonds that we have, or even, it's not the whole story. There's also broader scales. So for example, you can be fused with groups at a larger scale, and country bonds is one of them. And this is what we will focus on in our study as well. So for example, in this graph I'm showing here from a different study, you see that if people were presented with this famous trolley dilemma in philosophy, where they can either sacrifice one person, in this case themselves, or let 5 other people die, they're much more likely to sacrifice themselves, as you can see here on the rightmost gray bar, if they are fused with their country as compared to if they were not fused with their country. So fusion with larger groups can actually be very impactful in terms of determining individual behavior as well. Okay, so the aims and hypotheses of our study. Firstly, looking at the adherence and approval factors, we predicted that others' adherence behavior will predict self-adherence more than what others think. So we'll pay more attention to what others do rather than what they think. Secondly, like I have been saying, we are expecting a social scale effect such that the closed circle's actions and thoughts is going to be more important for us than that of our countries and that of the humankind in the world in general. There's perhaps one exception to that. If people are fused with their country, then we expect country's adherence to be very effective. And in addition to that, we looked at perceived vulnerability to the disease, and we looked at it both for self and other people whom our participants cared about. So we predicted that perceived vulnerability to self is obviously going to be a very important predictor of behavior because we're talking about a pandemic context. However, perceived vulnerability of close others is going to influence our behavior on top of our own vulnerability. And secondly, we predicted a nice interaction between perceived vulnerability and the size of your close social circle, such that if you have a large social circle, your perceived vulnerability would turn more into adherence behavior. So in terms of our methods, we obviously implemented an online survey in 12 languages from 9th of April until 24th of May, and each language was up online for 5 weeks. And we invited our respondents to refill the survey fortnightly for 3 months. But today I'm only going to talk about the time one data. And how did we measure these things that I've been talking about? So close social circle, firstly, we asked people whom they have contacted in the past week, and among those people, which ones they would turn to for advice or comfort with a major problem in their lives. So the number of those people that they indicated they would turn to was our measure for close social circle size. Fusion with country, we asked people how close or distant they felt towards their country on a pictorial scale, which had 2 circles representing self and country, and they were getting increasingly overlapping in our options. So if people chose the 100% overlapping option, that means that they are fused with their country. Vulnerability was assessed with 2 questions, asking on a scale, asking how vulnerable are you or someone you care about to the disease. And adherence was measured with the item, most people in my social network or country or world follow the advice of distancing. Similarly for self as well, people rated how much they have been following the advice. And importantly, we had the scale range from haven't been following the advice at all at the lowest end to have been following it exactly in the middle, and to have been doing more than what was advised at the extreme end, so we can see who is doing more than advised as well. And in a similar manner, we also asked people how much they and other people in their social network, country and world have been approving of the advice. I'm sorry, this is a copy paste there, not follow the advice. How much they thought the advice, following the advice was the right thing to do. So this is their approval. So we had participants, we had 6,674 participants from over 100 countries, and here is just some demographics of our participants. You can see that we had a majority of women and young people between ages, well, 16 to 49, although we had more elderly people join us as well. So it's a fairly good representation, I would say, in terms of age. In terms of education, not so good a representation. Most of our participants were either university or college educated. And in terms of occupation, again, we had a good range of people at full-time work, FT work here, part-time work, PT work, or full-time or part-time students. And because of this slightly uneven distribution of our demographic variables, we included all of these in all of our analysis as covariates to control for their effects. And this is just a nice world map that I found out you can do on PowerPoint that shows the number of participants we had in each country, how it maps onto the countries. And you can see that we had a fairly wide coverage of the world, although quite uneven in terms of the exact numbers that we got. And yet we still had 11 countries from whom we had more than 100 participants, 2 of them being more than 1,000 participants, Turkey and UK, which so happen to be the places I lived in the most. And I should say that in today's analysis, I'm not going to go into cross-cultural differences or anything. I will be presenting the global data altogether. Okay, so without further ado, the results. So remember that our first hypothesis was about the adherence versus approval. We hypothesized that adherence of others, their behavior is going to be more influential than their thoughts, how much they approve of distancing. And so to test that, we conducted 2 regression models, one model including the adherence variables of others plus self-approval, because obviously that is going to have a big impact anyway. And that model explained 27.96% of the variance of self-adherence. And another model, this time including others' approval rather than others' adherence. And you can visually see as well that that model explained far less of the variance. And a comparison of these non-nested models showed that that was a significant difference. So these results are confirming our first hypothesis that others' adherence was more important than others' abstract approval of the behavior. And in terms of the social scale effect that we were talking about, remember again that we expected our close social circle to be most effective, followed by country and then world. And that's exactly what we found for both the adherence and approval behaviors, but I'm just showing the highlight figures here. So we found that the adherence of our close social circle was greater than, had a greater impact on our behavior than the adherence of the country and the world. And more importantly, and kind of surprisingly for me at least, we found that adherence of our close social circle was even more influential on our behavior than how much we personally thought was distancing was the right thing to do. So this suggests that, and you can see it here, so adherence social is the social circle and approval self is here. I mean, just visually, you can compare these regression lines and you can see that it's a steeper line for the adherence, social to self-adherence prediction here on the left side. Oh, I should also say, yeah, we, so if anybody is interested in this kind of detail, this is obviously the same model that I just presented in the previous slide, but we're doing bootstrapping simulations to compare each effect to one another. And in addition, we looked at people who were fused with their country versus not fused with their country. And again, we found that the same social scaling effect very nicely play out here, such that if people were fused with their country, then the country's adherence strongly predicted their own behavior, whereas if they were not fused with their country, there was no such association. I think it's kind of important to note here, though, that even this significant relationship looks like visually, if you look at the way the data is distributed, it's less influential than the adherence of your close social circle. So even if you're fused with your country, it's still not the main predictor of your behavior. Your close social circle still seems to matter more. And when it comes to the vulnerability variables, again, we conducted 2 regression models predicting self-adherence. The first model had only vulnerability of self to the disease and its interaction with the social circle size. And the second model had both vulnerability of self and others as its predictors. And the second model, which included both the vulnerability of self and others, was a better fit than the model that did not include vulnerability of others. One thing I would really like to highlight here, which I think is a fascinating finding, is the R-squares. So R-square, for any of, if there's any one in the audience who's not science-oriented or science-educated, R-square is really the measure that, measure of how much of the variance in the outcome variable, in this case self-adherence, is explained through these predictors. And you see that only 1.9% of the self-adherence behavior could be explained by the vulnerability of self, and 2.2 could be explained by how much we thought ourselves and our close ones were vulnerable. So compared to the adherence behaviors before, These R-squares are really tiny, suggesting that it's not really all about vulnerability, but it's about the social behavior change, that social environments that changes our behavior in this pandemic context. And finally, just a quick note to show the interaction that we predicted between vulnerability of self and others, and how it is related to the social network size. We found that if people had a larger social circle, then their perceived vulnerability was more strongly and positively associated with their adherence of the distancing behavior. So this is a very interesting finding, and we can't read too much into it because we don't know exactly why, but there's a couple of suggestions we can make based on prior literature, such that, for example, the self-harm and self-care literature in health studies shows that people with chronic diseases tend to care more for themselves if they are receiving social support from others. So that might be something that kind of similar playing out here, such that if there are two people with equal levels of vulnerability to the disease, the one who receives more social support is more likely to act towards resolving the problem and adhere to the distancing rules to protect themselves and others. Then I will go if I have 5 minutes. So we also, collective responsibility was measured by an item like, at times like this, I think it's essential that people work in solidarity. The other one, collective efficacy, was measured by an item like, things are improving due to the collective efforts made. Vertical collectivism is a construct that defines how people identify themselves in relation to the society and how willing they are to sacrifice themselves for the interest of the group, even if they're not necessarily agreeing with what was going on. So it was measured using a standardized scale, which had an item like, I usually sacrifice my self-interest for the benefit of my group. And we also measured empathy using the empathy quotient scale, which had items like, I'm good at predicting how someone will feel. Is more vertical collectivism and empathy are more general traits that a person would have that defines how they're attuned with their social environment, whereas collective responsibility and collective efficacy are obviously more specific to this pandemic context. So including these 4 variables as well in a same model, together with our previous measures, we did like a big extravaganza regression to see which predictors survived and which ones were still more significant, highest contributors than others. And we see that the significance of vulnerability of others completely disappeared. Collective responsibility was not a significant contributor to self-adherence. Approval of how much you yourself approved of the rules and how much your close circle adhered were still the strongest predictors. So in conclusion, I think if we want to reach herd security for this pandemic, we really need to leverage humans' hypersociality rather than view that as a problem. And our findings suggest that policy implications should go beyond convincing individuals of the necessity of distancing or that this is the right thing to do. They should go beyond imposing legal bans, and instead they should, for rapid change to take place, they should create the infrastructure so that adherence can be attained in a widespread manner quickly, because other people will follow once they see that others are doing it. And public messaging and more nudging style strategies can be used to create cohesive communities. This seems really critical. And when I say communities, I mean it both at the small scale of social bubbles, closed social circle, as we talked about, and at a larger scale at national level. And these messages should crucially emphasize empathy, collectivistic attitudes, the efficacy of the actions being taken and the values that are shared in the community. There are obviously some caveats of this research such that it doesn't explain the whole story. We could have had more representative samples from the entire world, and we have not, at least yet, looked at cross-cultural or social economic differences, which we might hopefully do in the future. In future research, we will be looking at maintaining distancing by looking at our longitudinal data across the time points, and also focus more on vulnerable groups, specifically young people. So I'd like to thank everyone here and all of our participants. And if there are any questions or comments, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you very much, Bahar. Very interesting study, large study you conducted worldwide. That gives the first insight into people's behavior, right, based on personal judgments and social norms. I'm going to go first and in a question that's posted here in the chat from Rachel Sumner. First of all, she says, very interesting study, Bahar. Seems that social norms may be more important than personal judgments. Does this vary by country? Maybe cultural issues might influence the weight of social norms too.
It's possible. Like I said, we haven't looked at cross-cultural differences yet, but our aim is to make our data open access as well, so that other people can look into it too. Obviously, one important caveat of doing cross-cultural research is you really need to have representative samples, or at least comparable samples. If I'm comparing US to Bangladesh, from both which we have good amounts of data, but perhaps they're very different demographics, it may not be a fair comparison. So yeah, that just needs a bit further thought and attention before we can go into that kind of detailed analysis.
Right. Are you planning to expand on this research, collect more data, or maybe more diverse data? You mentioned some limitations in the demographics, for example.
Yeah.
Or get more detail into cultural differences within the data you have.
Yeah, I think we are, I am planning to collect more data, but like I mentioned in the last slide, I'm planning to collect it more on a focus vulnerability group, the young people group. And that's mainly because obviously this research is, I think, very important for expanding our understanding about how collective action takes place and our behavioral tendencies and so on. But admittedly, we did this study because we are living in a pandemic right now, right? We wouldn't have done exactly this study or looked at these issues apart from the context. So I think we need to look into what the context calls for, what kind of scientific information is most needed to help the society get through this better. And I feel like the next step that I would like to focus on, at least, is the impact it has been having on young people and how what kinds of social support could be provided for them.
Definitely, really, really interesting. Thank you very much. There are, of course, more comments in the chat. Feel free to reply to everyone to mention how interesting your work has been. Thank you, Bahar. We'll see you again later.
Yes.
You're around.